Picture a small piece of canvas and cork, faded, worn, stained with salt water and time, tied with simple rope. To look at it today, you might walk past it in a museum without a second glance. But this particular piece of canvas and cork has a story attached to it that will stop you cold. This life jacket was worn by a real human. Being on the night of April 14th, 1912, a night so cold the North Atlantic was like black glass. A night when the largest, most luxurious, most technologically advanced ship ever built struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. and began its descent into the freezing darkness below. A night when 1,517 people died. The person who wore this life jacket survived. And over a century later, after surviving not just the sinking but the entire 20th century, this small, unremarkable-looking piece of maritime safety equipment sold at auction for the equivalent of 25 crore rupees. Why would anyone pay that kind of money for a faded life jacket? Because it is not a life jacket anymore. It is a piece of the most famous disaster in human history. It is a physical connection to a night that changed how the world thought about technology, about class, about hubris, and about the terrifying randomness of survival and death. Before we talk about what this life jacket sold for and why, we need to go back. Back to the beginning of the Titanic story. Back to the grandest, most ambitious, most tragically overconfident shipbuilding project in history. Back to Belfast. Back to 1909. Back to the moment when a group of men decided they were going to build something the world had never seen, and in doing so, set in motion a chain of events that would end at the bottom of the North Atlantic and begin a story that would never, in over a century, stop being told. This is the story of the Titanic and the extraordinary life jacket that outlasted her. To understand why the Titanic's story still grips the world over a century later, you have to understand what the Titanic actually was. She was not merely a ship, she was a statement, a declaration by the industrial civilization of the early 20th century that human ingenuity had conquered nature. That engineering had defeated the sea. That technology had made the ocean as safe and comfortable as a luxury hotel on land. The White Star Line, the British shipping company that commissioned the Titanic, wanted to dominate the North Atlantic passenger trade. Their rivals at Cunard had speed. White Star decided to compete on size and luxury instead. They commissioned 3 ships, Olympic, Titanic, Britannic, sister, ships of unprecedented scale, the largest moving objects ever built by human hands. Construction of Titanic began at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast on March 31, 1909. The sheer scale of the project was staggering. Over 3,000 workers labored on her construction, and 3 of them died building her, their names largely forgotten by history. The ship required over 3 million rivets. Her anchors alone weighed 31 tons. Her rudder, the steering mechanism that would prove tragically inadequate on the night of the sinking, weighed over 100 tons. She was 882 feet long, nearly 270 meters, longer than 5 city blocks placed end to end. She was launched, slipped into Belfast Lough on May 31, 1911. Over 100,000 people watched. No champagne was broken over her bow. White Star Line never did that. She slid into the water silently, magnificently, without ceremony. Her interiors, fitted out over the following months, were extraordinary. First-class accommodations included a swimming pool, a squash court, a Turkish bath, a gymnasium, a dark room for photography enthusiasts, and dining rooms modelled on the finest hotels of London and Paris. The first-class à la carte restaurant could serve 137 guests. The first-class lounge was panelled in carved Georgian-style woodwork. Second class on the Titanic was better than first class on most other ships. Even third class, steerage, had private cabins rather than the open dormitories typical of other vessels. She was not just the largest ship in the world. She was the most luxurious floating environment ever created. And somewhere in the vast stores of safety equipment, loaded onto this extraordinary vessel were hundreds of life jackets, canvas and cork, simple, functional, designed to keep a human body afloat in the North Atlantic long enough to be rescued. One of those life jackets would be worn on the night of April 14th, 1912, and over a century later it would sell for a fortune. April 14th, 1912, 11:40 p.m. ship's time. Titanic had been at sea for 4 days. She was making excellent time across the North Atlantic, steaming at approximately 22 knots, about 40 kilometers per hour, through unusually calm and flat conditions. The sea was so calm that night that there were no waves to break against the base of icebergs, making them harder to spot in the crow's nest. The lookout position high on the forward mast, Frederick. Fleet had been on watch since 10 p.m. There were no binoculars available for the lookout crew that night. The binoculars that should have been there had been left behind when a crew member was transferred off the ship in Southampton. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet saw something in the darkness ahead. Something large, dark, growing rapidly. He rang the crow's nest bell 3 times, the signal for object ahead, and grabbed the telephone to the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. First Officer Murdoch ordered the ship harder starboard, turning left, and ordered the engines reversed. But at 22 knots, with a ship the size of Titanic, you cannot stop or turn quickly. Physics, not incompetence, sealed Titanic's fate. The iceberg struck the starboard side of the ship below the waterline, along a section approximately 90 meters long. The impact was not the catastrophic collision most people imagine. It was a grinding, scraping, shuddering contact that most passengers barely felt. But below the waterline, the damage was catastrophic. Titanic had been designed with a double, bottom and 16 watertight compartments. She could stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded. The iceberg had breached the first 6. Within 10 minutes of the collision, Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, who was on board, had inspected the damage and made his calculations. He told Captain Smith the terrible truth. Titanic would sink. She had perhaps 2 hours. There were 2,224 people on board. There were lifeboats for 178, and the first lifeboat to be lowered, with a capacity of 65 people, was launched with just 28 passengers aboard because passengers in first class refused to believe the ship was actually sinking. The orchestra played on. At 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic disappeared beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. She sank to the ocean floor 3,800 meters below where she would rest, undiscovered for 73 years. Of the 2,224 people aboard, 710 survived. 1,514 died. The disparity between survivors and dead was not random. It followed the brutal logic of class and proximity. First-class passengers had a survival rate of approximately 62%. Second class, 41%. Third class, the emigrants, packed into the lower decks, just 25%. The crew's survival rate was 24%. The children of first and second class survived at almost 100%. The children of third class survived at a little over 30%. These numbers tell a story about the Edwardian world that the Titanic's owners wanted to believe had been left behind. A story about who mattered and who didn't, about whose life was considered worth saving first. The survivors who made it into lifeboats spent between 90 minutes and several hours on the freezing North Atlantic before rescue arrived. The temperature of the air was around -2 degrees Celsius. The temperature of the water was -1.6, barely below freezing, cold enough to kill an unprotected person through hypothermia in minutes. The life jackets kept people afloat. They could not keep people warm. Those 1,514 people who died after the ship sank, the ones screaming in the water in the darkness, mostly died of hypothermia within 15 to 30 minutes. The lifeboats, many of them half empty, largely did not return to pull survivors from the water. They were afraid of being swamped. The person who wore the life jacket that would one day sell for millions was among the 710 who survived. They climbed into a lifeboat. They watched the ship disappear. They heard the screaming in the water fade into silence. They spent hours on the freezing ocean before the Carpathia arrived to rescue them. They kept the life jacket. Why would someone keep a life jacket after surviving the Titanic? Perhaps because some objects become too loaded with meaning to simply be discarded. When you have worn something on the night you survived, the greatest maritime disaster in history. When that canvas and cork kept you afloat while 1,514 other human beings died around you, you do not throw it away when you get home. You keep it, and eventually, over a century later, the world recognizes what you kept. The sinking of the Titanic changed the world. Not metaphorically, not gradually, immediately and practically, in laws, in regulations, in the design of every ship built after April 1912. Within a year of the sinking, the first international convention for the safety of life at sea had been convened. The rules it established that every ship must carry enough lifeboats for every person aboard, that lifeboat drills must be conducted regularly, that ships must maintain 24-hour radio watch, remain the foundation of maritime safety law to this day. The Titanic created the International Ice Patrol, still operating today, which monitors iceberg positions in the North Atlantic and shares that information with all shipping. The Marconi wireless operators who stayed at their posts sending distress signals until the very end, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, helped establish the principle that wireless communication was a safety necessity, not a luxury on ocean-going vessels. But the Titanic's legacy went deeper than regulations. The ship became a mirror in which the Edwardian world saw itself clearly. Perhaps, for the first time, the arrogance of believing technology had conquered nature, the grotesque inequality of a society in which the class you were born into determined whether you lived or died, the hubris of naming something unsinkable and then discovering the ocean had opinions on the matter. The Titanic entered mythology immediately. Within weeks of the sinking, the story was already being shaped into the narrative that would persist, of heroes and cowards, of women and children first, of the orchestra playing as the ship went down, of a tragedy that revealed character under pressure. Some of those narratives were true, some were exaggerated, some were invented entirely, but the story kept being told and retold again. Books, films, plays, exhibitions, documentaries. James Cameron's 9/7 film, the most expensive film ever made at the time of its release, became the highest-grossing film in history, winning 11 Academy Awards and introducing the Titanic story to a generation born 85 years after the sinking. And every retelling sent people back to the physical evidence, back to the artifacts, back to the objects recovered from the wreck and preserved in museums, back to the things that actual human beings had owned and touched and used on that night. Objects like a certain canvas and cork life jacket that had been kept for over a century. Objects that carry the weight of human history in their very fibers. Now we come to the life jacket itself and the extraordinary story of how it arrived at an auction house and what happened when it did. The life jacket that sold for the equivalent of 25 crore rupees was authenticated as having been worn by a Titanic survivor. The provenance, the documented history of ownership, traced it from the survivor through generations of family ownership to the present day. Provenance is everything in the world of historical artifacts. It is the difference between a piece of history and a piece of canvas. This life jacket came with documentation, with photographs, with family records establishing an unbroken chain of ownership. From the night of April 15, 1912, to the auction room, the auction house that handled the sale had seen extraordinary items pass through its rooms. But a life jacket from the Titanic, with authenticated survivor provenance, was in a category of its own. Titanic artifacts have always commanded extraordinary prices at auction. A first-class menu from the Titanic's last dinner is sold for tens of thousands of pounds. A deck chair recovered from the wreck site fetched over 100,000. A violin believed to have been played by the Titanic's bandmaster, Wallace Hartley, as the ship sank, sold for over £1 million in 2013. But a survivor's life jacket, the actual physical object that kept a person alive while 114 others died around them, represents something different, something more intimate, more morally charged. When bidding opened, the room understood it was not bidding on canvas and cork. It was bidding on survival, on the arbitrary grace of being in the right lifeboat. On the weight of 1,514, deaths measured against 710 survivals. On the question that every Titanic artifact implicitly asks, why did this person live when those others died? The bidding climbed, past the estimates, past the previous records for Titanic survivor artifacts, and when the hammer fell, the life jacket had sold for the equivalent of 25 crore rupees, over $3 million. The room was silent for a moment, then applause, because what had just been sold was not just a piece of maritime history. It was a reminder, physical, tangible, undeniable, that history is not an abstraction. It happened to real people. It was worn on real bodies. It kept real hearts beating through one of the coldest, darkest, most terrible nights in maritime history. And now it belongs to someone who understands that. Why does the Titanic still matter? It is a question worth asking seriously. Over 110 years have passed since that April night in 1912. 2 world wars have been fought. The moon has been walked on. The internet has connected every human being on Earth. Civilizations have risen and fallen in the century. Since those 1,514, people died in the North Atlantic. And yet here we are, still talking about the Titanic, still paying millions for a life jacket, still making films and books and documentaries, still traveling to Belfast to see where she was built and to memorials to mourn the dead. Why? Because the Titanic is not really a story about a ship. It is a story about us. It is a story about what happens when human beings become so convinced of their own power that they forget the basic humility that survival requires. The people who called this ship Unsinkable were not stupid. They were the best engineers, the most experienced mariners, the most sophisticated industrialists of their age, and they were wrong in the most catastrophic possible way. It is a story about inequality, about a world, our world, recognizably, in which the accident of birth into a particular class determines your access to safety, to lifeboats, to survival itself. The third-class children who died at 70% rates while first-class children survived at nearly 100% are not a historical footnote. They are a question that every society in every era must answer for itself. It is a story about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, about a musician who kept playing while the ship sank, about a wireless operator who stayed at his post until the water reached him, about a father who put his children in a lifeboat and stood back, about a survivor who kept a life jacket for a century, because some things are simply too important to throw away. And it is a story about memory, about why we preserve, about why that canvas and cork life jacket, practically worthless as an object, priceless as a piece of human history, commands the attention and the money of people who were not born when it was worn. We buy these things, we preserve these things, we pay extraordinary prices for them, because we understand, somewhere in the deepest part of ourselves, that history is not something that happened to other people in a distant past. History happened to people exactly like us, people who got on a ship one morning thinking they were sailing to a new life, people who dressed for dinner and danced in the ballroom, and went to bed without knowing what was coming. People who put on a life jacket in the dark and lived, or didn't. That life jacket is not canvas and cork. It is the weight of 1,514 deaths and 710 survivals. It is a question about luck and class and fate, and the terrifying randomness of who makes it and who doesn't. It is a reminder that every human life, including yours, including mine, balances on the edge of the same cold North Atlantic night. The Titanic sank. But the story never did, and it never will. If this story of the Titanic's extraordinary life jacket moved you, if you found yourself thinking about that night differently, please subscribe to Historic Horizons. Leave a comment below telling us what you think. Could you have survived the Titanic? And share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Every artifact, every week. The life jacket has spoken.